everybody. My name is Nirali Mata. I'm the owner and founder of Nirali Advisory. We're an independent education consulting firm where we help students with their applications when they want to go abroad to study. This includes undergrad, summer schools, postgrad, as well as MBA studies. As a part of our guest speaker series, we invite some amazing people to come and discuss a little bit about their journey and things that we can learn from their journey. Today, very, very special with us. His name is Stephen Turban. And Stephen's going to tell us a little bit about himself before we start with the question and answers.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you. I'm obviously a big fan, and excited to talk a little bit about what I do, and I think it's immensely important. So just a little bit on my background. So I'm currently a PhD student at Harvard Business School. I'm also a director of Lumiere, which is a education social enterprise that helps students do research with top researchers around the world. Before then, I was a kind of consultant at McKinsey. I used to work for a startup university here in Vietnam called Fulbright University, and then I was at Harvard College as an undergrad. And I mean, one of the big themes, and we'll talk about this later in my life and for my family's life, has been the impacts of higher education. I'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but one of the big stories within my family has been how my grandfather, who was Jewish in Germany in the 30s, never got the opportunity to study college because of the Holocaust, and because of from Germany to the United States, and doing it right when he was about to enter college, actually probably right around the same time as many of the students that you work with. And my dad grew up really poor, so never had the opportunity to, never had those educational resources. Eventually, though, when he was about to enter college, his dad passed away, and so he started diving into studies, kind of to live in memory of his dad. And I had a really cushy business school professor as a dad. It's a very different story of my dad, but again, that theme of education being very important. So I'm really excited to talk about this because for me, education is at the center of everything that I do, and also the center for, of frankly, my family's life for the past few generations.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for being with us today. So I have a plan for the interview. We're going to divide it into two parts because I think there are two very specific things that everyone who's watching this will be interested in. One is about your journey, your educational journey into Harvard, and how you made it there, and your personal and professional background. And the second part will be the importance of research and your current project, which is to do with Lumiere Education. So moving on to the first part of our interview series, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I mean, I know you threw a little bit of light, but more to do with your story, background, your driving values that made you who you are today and allowed you to explore these amazing organizations that you've been a part of.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about an important part of my life. Maybe there's two quick moments to touch on in my life. The few years right before I entered Harvard as an undergrad, and then my experience right after I left Harvard, very, very connected actually. I grew up primarily in Missouri, which is kind of this rural part of the United States, right in the center. And I was not a good student, to be honest. I was pretty mediocre. I was maybe not terrible, but not good by any means. And one of the big things that changed in my life was right around 10th grade. I mean, I had pretty bad grades, like just to be perfectly honest with you. And I had this teacher who essentially just took me aside and said, Steve, I feel like you're not living up to your own potential. You're not really applying yourself. And I really wanted to go to this AP class, which is one of the top classes in my high school. And he essentially said, I'm not going to let you do it until you prove to me that you deserve it. And that really changed how I saw myself. I had always kind of given myself excuses in life to say, I'm not doing well, but I'm so smart, or I'm nice. And I kind of dropped giving myself excuses, and really started focusing on school. Started thinking about trying to really elevate myself by going to a top university. I ended up deciding in part to do that by taking a year off of high school. So many people take gap years in college. I took a gap year in high school, and I decided to move to Taiwan, where I lived for a year as an exchange student. So I went to a public high school. I studied in Chinese. Spent a lot of time. I went to an all-boys school, which is totally another kind of random part of life. And then I came back to high school. I was a super senior. I was like 19 in high school. Not a good look for anyone, but particularly not me at the But then eventually applied and got into Harvard. So that's a big moment. And another moment I think is important for how I life is right when I was about to leave Harvard. I knew I wanted to do a PhD in a business school, which I'm doing right now. And I was thinking about applying directly to a PhD program, but I had this amazing mentor. His name's David. And David essentially, he's an amazing professor at HBS. He said, Stephen, if you want to answer big questions about the world, you should go and experience it. And I thought that was really good advice. And so I decided that I would try to make it into kind of like an academic structure, even outside of school. So what I decided is I would break my following 3 years into 2 semesters. So one semester I'd work trying to understand what big international corporations are like, and one semester I'd work trying to see what startup institutions are like. And so my first year and a half, 2 years, I worked at McKinsey. Ended up entering McKinsey, and we talk about that. But in the second half, I worked for this startup university, this really ambitious educational project here in Vietnam. And then this past year I applied to PhD programs. I was happy to get into HBS, and so kind of returned back to Harvard. But I think those are kind of 2 important pivotal points in my life. When one to 2 teachers who said, one teacher said, "Hey, Stephen, you're not living up to your potential." Another teacher said, "If you want to do good in the world, you have to know what is the world even look like." Yeah, this is just a little bit on, on my experience, my background.
Thank you so much for sharing these things. I'm sure like so many people can relate to this, right? That sometimes we definitely need somebody to just tell us to look in a different direction. I mean, the potential is there, but like just for somebody to direct it in the right way. So thank you so much for sharing this. And I love the fact that you said, about going out in the world to experience it before you can come back and explore it and understand it, which I thought was a very, very good and practical suggestion. Moving on to the next question. So how did you prepare yourself for Harvard once that you had this teacher living up to your potential? I mean, you threw a little bit light on the fact that you went you took a gap year and you went to Taiwan, but what else did you start doing that allowed you to get an not easy access, but allowed you to stand out in front of other candidates at really extremely competitive environments, be it McKinsey or even the Fulbright University fellowship that you're a part of?
Totally. For these types of things, I really don't like to leave things up to chance. So, but it is up to clear. So it's like all these things are kind of crapshoots, whether it's a Harvard or a McKinsey, whatever it might be. But when I was a sophomore, I started thinking, okay, how can I position myself? Because of course, in the United States, it's kind of a whole package type of thing. If it was just academics, I would probably have been it would have been tough. But I thought really strategically, how do I need to position myself? And what I had against me was that I had pretty bad grades, my at least. So I started thinking, okay, how do I stand out? And then also, how do I make up for these grades? Because I felt like that was going to. So what I did was I decided I was going to do 3 things. I said, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get good grades. So I'm going to try to, kind of return back to a focus on academics I really never had. And so I started really diving into academia, like in terms of high school classes. I mean, I went from being like the class clown to being the most intense person in the class.
Wow.
Still making jokes, but like, I remember I would spend, there was this like social studies quiz, which is notoriously hard. And I would spend 5 or 6 hours memorizing. I could recite to you like paragraphs in this we needed to, just because I really wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. So that was kind of step 1. But I still wouldn't end up with a very good GPA because of that. So I started thinking, okay, what are the other 2 things? And they ended up being around testing and then around kind of my own personal story. And for testing, I just got, again, I said, if I have a not strong GPA, then I really need to have strong test scores. And so again, I spent, a lot. When I say a lot of time, I mean a lot of time, probably in the order of 100 to 200, maybe 300 hours, prepping for these, standardized tests. I ended up getting a perfect score on the ACT, and because I took it multiple times, because I was really obsessed with it, not because, again, that I'm just like really smart. I really don't believe actually in people being smart. I just think about how much have you practice something. I just really put in the practice. And then that final piece about Taiwan was also a part of it, where I said, you know, how do I tell an interesting story? And I knew a big part of myself that I really loved was language learning. I'd studied Spanish. I loved it. I was really into it. It's the one subject I was good at. Maybe I could try to learn a different. Okay, you know, it's gonna kind of suck to take a year off. I'm not gonna graduate with my friends, but I think it'll be worth it in the end. I think it was. I mean, I think it was a great choice. So that was how I thought about undergrad. Um, and then for graduate school is very different. Would you like me to kind of dive into how I thought about that?
Of
Uh,
course, yes,
yeah.
yes, absolutely.
Graduate school is very different because, at least in the U.S., so undergrad for the U.S., it's all about like this package. You're telling a narrative. It's not about the individual per se, but about like
The
profile.
packaging.
Yeah, it's who you are. Grad school, particularly PhD programs, is about the person. Uh, and so what I did for that, again, I try not to leave things up to chance. I mean, I was very lucky because I was at Harvard as an undergrad, and so I had really strong, I maintained really strong relationships with my mentors there who supported me in the PhD process. But then I was very clear about knowing everything about the programs I was applying to. So I probably spoke to 60 or 70 people when applying to
Wow.
grad school programs, whether it's the professors I wanted to talk to or the grad students or people who had previously applied. I mean, I had probably had like a phone call every night for like 6 months, maybe three a week actually is probably more accurate. Um, and then I ended up choosing, I chose Harvard. But I was accepted to all the programs I applied to. Again, not because I think I stood out in any remarkable way, but because I knew exactly what the program wanted. And I really did not want to leave it up to chance. And so, to me, I guess, you know, I mean, I hope this doesn't come off as like braggadocious. It's not meant to be. What it really, to me, the theme is, I have a pretty low opinion of myself in general, in the sense that I don't think I'm particularly special in many ways. I don't think I'm like, I mean, just knowing my classmates at Harvard, even high school, I think many of my friends are much smarter than me. You know, much better writers, much more talented. But I was always into the idea that if you push yourself, you can make stuff happen. And so I think that's one of the traits that I always kind of take into these processes. That you just kind of have to, you know, you have to put in the time. You have to believe. You have to have a strategy. You need to put in the time. And if you do those two things, generally, things will turn out for the best.
That's so true. And thank you so much for sharing this. I've been interviewing people, and, this is one theme that's coming across very strongly for most people who are at the position that you are, is that they knew what they were looking for, they had a plan, and they weren't afraid to work really, really hard, put in that level of focus, time, effort, energy into it. So I think, just as you said, just talking to tons of people, knowing what you want, and then really just going after it. So thank you so much for sharing something so personal, and I'm sure that a lot of us watching this, irrespective of whichever stage that of life that we're in, I think this would definitely be very, very motivating for everybody. Moving on to the next question. So once you were in there at all these places which are so competitive, how did you manage to cope with the rigor and the competition? And how did you keep yourself really motivated and upskilled, and even had to unlearn a few things that you previously
Yeah.
learned as a part of your belief system?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Well, so the I don't know if this comes across from what I just described, which kind of described me as someone who's very oriented, but I am very goal oriented, but I'm also not very competitive. Does that, that's,
That
I think,
I get it.
does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, you don't need to think that you need to be above somebody to go ahead. You can go ahead just because you want to go ahead. So that absolutely makes sense. I hear you.
Yeah, yeah, and I think for me the way that kind of manifests itself is that um, I I I actually don't. Well, I mean, applying to college is kind of, you have to do it, but I try not to end up in a place where it's a zero sum game. Like, I don't like those situations very much because
Right.
I don't have a super high opinion of myself, like in this sense, and I think I'll just get destroyed. You know, like that's probably the reality. Is that, I mean, there's just a lot of really smart people out there who are really talented and are probably even harder working than I am. And you know, life is a kind of, I studied statistics in undergrad, and chances are, if you're going head to head with a ton of people who are amazing, then you're probably going to lose. You know, you might win, but you'll probably will lose. And so I really like to do stuff that is feels not competitive, but is value adding. So
Right.
for me, when I was undergrad, I studied statistics, which was really fun. Again, statistics is like this kind of weird field at the time, and still kind of today. It's not like it's not like I'm studying physics or math or CS, you know, where it's like, this is like the most intense thing. But it is rigorous, but it's kind of just fun. It's kind of, and people in statistics are not trying to, you know, prove how good they are at statistics. I think it's a little different from say like a math or a physics. And then even like in clubs, you know, I didn't at Harvard, there are all these super competitive clubs that I did not get into. I totally did not get into any of these clubs. So I spent most of my time at Harvard building a student organization that's actually still at Harvard today called the Franklin Fellowship with a few of my friends. And so there's no, you know, to me, that was an example where, you know,
You found your own
again,
tribe and you didn't find the
yeah,
need to put somebody down or above to get where you had to go. I think that's a great strategy.
yeah, I think to me, I think that's a big theme. And so, coping with rigor and competition, maybe my quick answer is I try to avoid it and try to like just kind of play in my own pool. You know, it's like because I think it's a bit more, it's more relaxing for sure. I think it's more kind of more fun.
Got it. Thank you so much. So I think that's definitely good advice. You know what you want to do and not really be bothered that much by the environment you're in, and just go your own way wearing binders. So I think that's a very, very good thing that I think a lot of us can follow as well. Moving on to the next question. So, is there any particular advice that you'd want to give since you spent a considerable amount of time in that place for students who are wishing to apply to Harvard for their undergrad or grad school?
Yeah, I would give very different advice for those applying to undergrad or grads. Well, let's say undergrad or PhD program, grad school.
Okay.
If you find, let's say this undergrad advice, I think will apply broadly to say business school, maybe law school. Um, for undergrad, you really want to for me, the advice that was most useful is how can you meet the bar, which is this academic bar. You need to be excellent, but you don't need to be like ridiculous. And and then how do you show something that's really unique, really interesting that someone says, oh, that's kind of fun. Like that's just kind of that's cool. You know, for me, that was my strategy. It was like, you know, I want to hit the academic bar, do well enough in my GPA, test scores that kind of balance out my GPA. But then I want to be that student who's like loves languages and loves volunteering and does like lots of like student clubs. Like that was essentially what I felt like my angle was. For grad school, especially PhD programs, you want to prove you know what you're getting into. So you want to be able to talk the talk that they're speaking to you. If you say something, um, for example, I study in organizational behavior. So that's a study of organizations. If you told me that, hey, I'm interested in the study of uh, teams, and you just said the study of teams, but you didn't say meso-organizational behavior, which is just a term that exists in my field, is kind of a random term, uh, then I would know the student who uses the specific term would immediately be in my in-group versus the student
Got
that
it.
kind of says a lot of things. So you need to do your legwork to understand what is the language of the people there. You have to prove, hey, you know, I know this and I actually want to do it. That's particularly true for PhD programs. I think the advice can for the MBA, et cetera. I haven't applied to MBA programs, but I think is closer to the undergrad.
Got it. No, I think that's very good advice because and I love the fact that you differentiated between the two because for one, you can be good at a lot of things and you can say I'm interested because you're looking at potential in that sense. And for the other, you need to have some sort of an exposure, some amount of vocabulary, some amount of exposure, and you should know what you're doing. It has to be that specific and that detailed. So thank you so much for sharing that part with us. So moving on to the second part of the interview, where we're going to talk about the very interesting story that you mentioned at the beginning about your grandfather being in research and about how we can, that prompted you to start this amazing organization called as Lumiere Education. So can you tell me a little bit about that? In your opinion, can you throw a little bit of light on Lumiere Education, its background, and what
Yeah.
makes this venture so special for you?
Yeah. So Lumiere Education is a social enterprise focused on making research opportunities available for talented students around the world. We have our flagship program is the Lumiere Research Scholar Program, in which students work one-on-one with a research mentor for 10 weeks. These mentors are researchers at places like Harvard, Oxford, Stanford, the best universities, top researchers in their field, on an independent project. So a student is developing their own independent project. They're not necessarily, pipetting for their researcher. They're really developing something unique, something that they've developed. The reason why I work on this, I talked a little bit previously about the story of my grandfather, how he never got the opportunity to go to college because of the Holocaust. But there's a piece around it which I think is really important, which is the experience of his father, my great grandfather. So my great grandfather was this famous physician in Germany. He was a physician researcher. He wrote about the human body. He wrote a number of books which became quite popular in Europe during the time. And he was really passionate about research. In this case, his research was around how do you make the study of the human body into something that's understandable for other people. His son, my grandfather, Raphael, always wanted to be like his dad, but because of the Holocaust, because of him fleeing Germany, he never got to study and finish college. And my dad grew up in the United States, again, very poor. And when my dad was about to enter college, his dad passed away. And so the piece of the story which is important is that my dad started thinking about, how he could live through his dad's memory. And one of the things they decided was that his dad never got the opportunity to dive into higher education, and particularly never got to dive into the opportunity of research. So my dad started working at a research lab in psych, fell in love with it. Eventually, he was not a great student himself, kind of a similar theme maybe in our family. And then eventually went on to do a PhD, became a professor. And for me, my life was changed when I was at Harvard by working with this professor, David Garvin, who was a researcher at HBS, and really he's the reason I'm doing a PhD today. And so Lumiere Research Scholar Program, it's all about a student having the opportunity that I got, that my dad got, and that my grandfather didn't get, which is around diving into a research area of interest, of passion, and having a mentor who can help guide you in that process.
That is so incredible. And I genuinely, even when the first time that I spoke to you, I did think this was such a great idea. And I think in a country like India, this would definitely provide tons of really smart people a reason to dream and have ambition to work with some of the bright minds in that particular field. So I think that's great. Moving on to the next question. So in your opinion, why is research so important? And, how does a research project help a person personally, academically, as well as professionally? And when I say professionally, I mean more in like a corporate space.
Yeah. So let me kind of break that question into two parts. So one is why is research important for you? Let's say as you're thinking about your next steps, maybe in school, maybe in grad school, and we'll talk about that. And the second piece is, how is research important in general? And really, I think of this in terms of both kind of the impact and on broader society and on yourself. But let's start on like the kind of your own life type of thing in terms of next steps. So one of the great things about research, which is why we really recommend it for students who have an intellectual passion, is that it shows a level of academic that just being good at it can never show. If you're doing research in an area of, let's say, looking at the economic impacts of COVID, which some of our students are doing, that reflects a real level of curiosity about the world. I mean, it shows that, hey, not only do I care about economics? And maybe I want to study economics in the UK or the US, whatever it is. But also I've done research on it. I've worked with an academic whose whole life is answering questions about how the economy works. One of the great values of research is that it reflects your interest and it shows the level of academic excellence and curiosity that you wouldn't otherwise have if you were just saying, hey, I like to study economics or I like to study physics. That's a big difference, both for undergrad and for grad school. So that's a little bit on, how is research important for you as you think about your own applications and your next steps. What I think is almost more interesting is how is research important to you for your life and your own development. Let me first say that research is not only important for you, but also for others. So if we think about how humanity makes progress, we make progress by understanding the world and answering questions about it. Of DNA, or even more recently of CRISPR technology, revolutionizing how we think about gene editing, our ability to approach genetic diseases, changed because of research that happened across the U.S. In labs at Berkeley and labs at Harvard and MIT. But for you as an individual, your own learning, it's immensely valuable. The types of skills that you learn by doing research is really focus, able to answer and create a distinct question, and then think about rigorously, how can I answer that question? And think about it. So how do I ask the right question? How do I answer that question? And that is, exactly what I did when I worked at McKinsey. It's, we have essentially a company comes to a company like McKinsey and says, hey, I don't know what to do in this area. How should I do it? And what research does, whether it's in the sciences, in the humanities, in the social sciences, you're essentially doing the exact same thing. And you're maybe doing it at a level of rigor that even someone at, say McKinsey is not achieving. And so that is immensely valuable, because it's much easier to go to a very deep level of rigor and then go back out and say, okay, here, I now know how to cut corners, than it is to start with cutting corners and then try to go deep. It's very hard to move. So I think if you're thinking about your own learning, even professionally, doing research allows you to get at the people and work with the people who are the most rigorous. I do truly believe that researchers are the most rigorous group at answering questions. And then you can always step back and, recognize that you can do, at McKinsey we call 80-20. You can figure out, how do you use 20% of your effort to get 80% of the answer. But you do that from a place of knowing, what does the world-class answering and question asking look like?
Got it. I think that's very interesting, and I'm sure that so many of us can take insights into just how much that level of rigor, or as you said, cutting corners, could help in moving ahead whichever direction we want to go in. So that's something very interesting. Thank you for sharing. Moving on to the next question. So you broadly spoke about what research is, but if we have to dive a little deeper into the answer to it, what are the different types of research that are out there, and what are the different methodologies associated with it? Some of the major misconceptions that people have about research. Can you throw a little bit of light on that?
Yeah, for sure. And maybe I'll just preface this by saying that, I love research. Of course, I'm doing a PhD. I work with a company, Lumiere, where our goal is about providing research opportunities for students around the world. That doesn't necessarily mean that research is for everyone. If you're not curious about how the world works, if you just want to get something done, research is probably not for you. So I just want to kind of lay that out, because I'm not ignorant of the fact that research is for people who are curious about the world and want to answer important questions. But many people have other goals, so that's totally fine. Now, what is research, and what are some misconceptions? Let me just say the biggest misconception about research that I see is that it only happens in a wet lab. People think about research often, they think of some crazy scientist, usually with white hair, with a pipette, kind of just like, face mask on, pipetting away in their lab. Now that is a form of research. It's a great form of research. It's called lab-based research, but there are many other types of research. Examples include quantitative research. This is my area of expertise, where we look at essentially large data sets or even small data sets to answer questions about the world. There's qualitative research, in which you're talking to people, trying to understand what is this person's experience like. Fields like anthropology and sociology have a lot of qualitative research. And then there's theory-based research, and you can think of this as research that's about proving some axiom about the world or trying to weave together different arguments to come to a new theory. Mathematicians are primarily theoretical researchers. You know, they're not looking at data by and large, though some are, but by and large they're not. They're trying to answer improve a new theorem or prove something that allows us to generalize some result to the world. So there's many types of research, and I think, you know, one of the things that's really cool about working with Lumiere and working on Lumiere is that we have a lot of students who come in interested in the sciences, and we have amazing mentors, you know, in physics, math, chemistry, etc. But we also have students who are approaching research for the first time in a subject that they know, but they may have not done research before. So that could include, you know, we have one student doing research on protest movements in Hong Kong. I mean, that's super cool. Like, I'm really interested in that. We have another student who's looking at what are the economic impacts of different regulations or COVID-related regulations on labor outcomes in India. I mean, that's really interesting. That's a type of economics research. So it's really cool. I mean, I think the biggest misconception of research is that it's just lab-based research for a few discrete fields, and it's really much more broadly. If there's an intellectual question, then researchers are almost undoubtedly working on it.
That's amazing. And those are some really fun topics that people are working on.
Yeah, it's really
Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next question, you know, if you do find yourself as somebody who's extremely curious of the world and, you know, who really wants to dive deep into the questions, where is it that you sort of start? Where do you, like, how do you choose a research topic or a methodology or a mentor or project which would be a good fit for you? Like, where do you begin?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. Nirali, I appreciate you asking, because I think this is actually where most students get stuck. And the answer is a bit about how science is structured today. So science is essentially structured in communities of learning. So if you think about how do we know what is the frontier of a current science, you need to know what is the accepted state of the art in order to ask a new question. I see a lot of students I've heard of a lot of students who've kind of gone out and done research on their own, which I think is very admirable. I'm excited by that drive. But unlike creating an organization where you can try to solve a problem, you know, because maybe you have a unique perspective given, you know, where you are or your resources, with research it's really hard to do that without understanding what has come before you. So you really, I mean, the first step is, before asking a question, is trying to understand what exists out there. What is the state of the art already in the field? And one of the best ways to do that is by having a mentor. Another good way to do that is by reading deeply in the topic and trying to understand, you know, what is happening out there. But I think that preparation piece is essential for you to be successful in doing research.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it. And yeah, you're so right. I love you started where you said it actually comes from a community of people that, and, you know, community of information that you sort of need to dive in before you start off and venture on your own. So I think that's definitely a very important theme that people should keep in mind before they start. And my last question is, you know, how does one apply to your organization? What can you do to better your chances of getting in? And, you know, how do you approach the form and, you know, the entire application process at Lumiere Education?
Yeah, so we have a competitive application process. That's because our mentors are amazing. I mean, just incredible. And so we look for students that we think can work well with those mentors. We have this whole application form. Yeah, I think, you know, I encourage people to apply if they're excited about research. But here's what you can do to stand out. Here are the three traits we're looking for. We're looking for academic excellence, curiosity, and drive. So when you're thinking about applying, which you can find at the website, we have, you know, different cohorts that start at different time periods over the course of a year. But think about how you can highlight those things like curiosity and drive. And ways to do that is by talking about things that interest you. So being very specific about what are the things around you that fascinate you? I mean, I remember I had this one student who applied, and she's interested in economics, and she talked about how she was interested in the economics of street food sellers. And she talked about it for
Wow.
like maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs about, what are the economics, what are the incentives that they're facing. And I was like, that's a really cool way, and it reflects a curiosity about the world. She studied economics at a high school level, hadn't dove in that deep, but she'd already started to apply it to people that she saw around her on the streets who were selling uh, food. So I mean, that's a great way to stand out, is to be very specific about your interest, and spend some time on the application. That's really the most important piece.
Got it. Thank you so much, Stephen, for taking the time today to come join us and to tell us about so many interesting things and how we can approach them. Thank you for sharing such valuable information. And we look forward to collaborating and connecting with you a lot more in the future.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
This was great, and I really appreciate you asking such thoughtful questions. I mean, uh, they're really important, and they definitely show, the level of expertise that you have when you're thinking about this process and about how people think about their own future. So, yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.